Second witness, mic check, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we're done with opening, so it's
Yeah.
ready?
All right, everybody. The Rules Committee will come to order. Thanks for your patience, everyone. I know it's been a long month with a lot happening, but I find times like these are a refreshing reminder that democracy is not easy. This afternoon, we will consider H.R. 4521, the CHIPS and Science Act. After more than a year of negotiations, we have a product that has the bipartisan, bicameral backing needed to make it to the President's desk. There are many important ideas in this bill, creating 100,000 new, good-paying jobs that will move our workforce into the 21st century, lowering costs for American families by helping to end the shortage of semiconductors that have driven up the price of everything from cars to consumer goods. Semiconductor chips are literally in almost everything that we use. Our cell phones, medical devices, I might go on and on and on. So strengthening programs like the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which has been hugely successful in my district of Massachusetts, creating jobs and delivering a high return on investment to taxpayers, investing in basic research and development, making America more competitive, reinvigorating manufacturing, turbocharging innovation, and investing in our STEM workforce. I think this is a necessary bill for the sake of economic security and our national security. China has been out-investing us in this area. However, let me just say, for the record, I'm frustrated that American families are consistently told that the country does not have enough money, for example, to extend the child tax credit, or to give children free breakfasts and lunches at schools, or to guarantee health care for all Americans, or to help parents pay for child care. In fact, we're told time and time again that these ideas are too expensive. Yet here we are, investing a necessary but significant amount, in semiconductor chips, which I will support this bill. But I wish we could be making equal or greater investments into programs like nutrition assistance, school meals, affordable housing, and child tax credits. But as I said before, this is a national security issue, this is a jobs issue, and this is something we need to move forward on. The pandemic highlighted this country's major supply chain issues. Too many things are being made overseas, and semiconductor chips, essential to so many products we rely on every day, are among the things that we have offshored over the years, making us vulnerable to severe supply chain disruptions. That needs to end, and this bill will ultimately tackle supply chain vulnerabilities, create 100,000 good-paying jobs, lower costs for consumers, and pave the way for decades of economic growth and scientific discovery. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I am now happy to turn this over to my good friend, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today's hearing covers the Senate amendment to H.R. 4346, what is now being called the CHIPS Plus bill. As anyone who's observed this process knows, the road to get us to this point has been a long, winding, and frequently frustrating one. Earlier this year, Democratic leadership considered a wholly inadequate bill in the House, as it did nothing to reposition the United States to confront communist China or to set up our semiconductor industry for success. Instead, it was a bill written behind closed doors in the Speaker's office that masked its inadequacy behind a laundry list of requests for a, quote, strategy, unquote, and requirements to file reports. Thankfully, what we are considering today from the Senate is a bipartisan bill, which passed that chamber by a vote of 64 to 33, and will actually accomplish something for America to ensure our competitiveness with China. The measure includes a significant investment in our semiconductor industry so that we will be able to manufacture those critical pieces of technology domestically, plus significant investments in the sciences. While today's bill is not perfect, and it's not the one I would have written if I had the power to act on my own, I do think it's a good bill overall. As I'm sure my colleague from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, will describe, this bill includes a once-in-a-generation reform to the federal science agencies. I understand that some of my Republican colleagues have concerns, particularly around the wisdom of providing incentives for the semiconductor industry and about the overall cost of the bill. I look forward to discussing these concerns during our hearing today. With that, before I yield back, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield quickly to my friend from Texas who has an important announcement for the benefit of the committee, Mr. Burge. Is that all right? Absolutely. I yield to my friend.
Thank you, Mr. Cole, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I don't know what's going to happen going forward, but this could possibly be our last rules meeting before the end of the August recess.
Don't hold your breath.
But it is possible that it could be the last. And if it is, at the conclusion of the month of August, I will lose my legislative director and rules associate, Rachel Huggins, who's been with me for, I think, both of our terms in the minority here on the Rules Committee, been in my office longer, came to me from Kristi Noem's office when she left to be governor of South Dakota. So Rachel's been right there with us through all of these late nights and long days, and she's done a great job of making me seem prepared, even on days when perhaps I wasn't prepared, and we'll greatly miss her. She is, as they say, going to a better place. She'll be working for the diplomatic corps, and will do her country proud with her efforts on the diplomacy front. So, round of applause if everyone would for Rachel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and let me, I never really do this, let me associate myself with your remarks. But best of luck, Rachel, we're going to miss you, and thank you for all your incredible service on this committee and to the Congress and to the country. Appreciate it. All right, so Ranking Member Cole yields back, and I now welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on the Senate amendment to H.R. 4346, CHIPS and Science. Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, we are delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Chairwoman Johnson. You need to unmute. Anybody, I think you have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
No, we can't hear you, yeah. Try one more time, yeah. Try now. No?
Okay, can you hear me?
What?
Okay.
Okay,
Well, thank you very much, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and distinguished members of the Rules Committee for allowing me to testify today on H.R. 4346, the CHIPS and Science Act. This bill has a somewhat convoluted history, which I won't fully describe in the interest of saving time. Essentially, what we have before us today is the portion of the Competes Conference that the Science, Space, and Technology Committee was the lead conferee over Division B, as well as the CHIP provisions in Division A, which we worked on together with our friends in Energy and Commerce Committee. The underlying bill also contains funding for Supreme Court security enhancements. I'm very proud of the work that was done to get this bill before us today. The Compete Conference was a very difficult negotiation. However, I think we have done very well with the offshoot of the conference, and that is before us today. I'll speak very briefly about what it is contained in the bill before us. Division A is a slightly modified version of CHIPS Act from the Competes Conference. These vital provisions will provide a comprehensive national industrial policy for reinvigoration of semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. After America dominated this field in its early years, we've seen a steady offshoring of semiconductor manufacturing to other countries. I think we all now understand the strategic folly of offshoring such critical components of our modern economy and military. More than that, we also have lost an entire ecosystem of high-tech jobs. The CHIPS Act will help us reverse that trend and bring these high-paying jobs back. Now I want to turn to the Science Division. Almost all of the pieces of this division are comprised of bills that the Science Committee had previously marked up and in many cases had also passed the House. And all of those bills were constructed in a bipartisan manner with my friend and ranking member Frank Lucas. There are two essential pieces to the Science Division. First, we comprehensively reauthorize the activities of the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and the Department of Energy's Office of Science. And these authorizations set critical policy guidance to our core physical science agencies. It also authorized funding increases to ensure the United States remains a world leader in innovation. We also authorize important activities as the National Aeronautical and Space Administration and address other discrete research topics across the government science agencies. The second largest component of the Science Division is our effort to broaden participation in science and technology by underrepresented communities and minorities. This is the most comprehensive effort Congress has made at addressing inequities in the sciences, and it has been a personal focus of mine since I first came to Congress. I have always said that if America is going to succeed as a world leader in science and technology, we must fully utilize all of our nation's talent to do so. The bipartisan provisions in this bill will go a long ways toward ensuring that goal becomes a reality. I would be the first to say that there were compromises made in getting to this final product. I'm sure that Ranking Member Lucas and I both point to provisions in the bill we would prefer to change. But that is the nature of compromise. In the end, I'm very proud to support the legislation before us today, and I hope we can swiftly consider it in the House and send it to the President. I thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I now yield to Ranking Member Lucas.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole. I'm glad to join you to discuss H.R. 4346, the CHIPS and Science Act. This bill has been a long time coming. When I first took leadership of the House Republican Science Committee as ranking member in 2019, developing legislation to strengthen American science and technology was my highest priority. After extensive work in January of 2020, I introduced a comprehensive bill that created a long-term strategy for investment in basic research and infrastructure to protect the economic and national security of the United States. That policy to strengthen Americans' research and development enterprise is what I'm here to discuss today. I support Division A of H.R. 4346, which invests in semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. I believe it's necessary for our national security and for our continued competitiveness. And I'm pleased that it includes strong guardrails that House Republicans developed to ensure the funds are not misused or funneled to China. That said, although CHIPS is grabbing all of the headlines, I'm here to tell you that the investments in American R&D will have a longer lasting impact. The CHIPS policy will build factories now, but the research policy will build decades of scientific innovation and economic growth. This research bill is not perfect, and the process that got us here was downright atrocious. But somehow, we still landed in a good place. As I said in 2020, I first introduced competitiveness legislation, and this was fundamental to the bipartisan talks we began with our committee's majority. Working together, we developed a package of 12 bills that set a strategic direction for our scientific enterprise, doubled our investments in basic research, expanded our STEM workforce, and strengthened our ability to protect our research from foreign theft. Many of those bills passed the House on suspension, and the core bills, authorizing investments in the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy Office of Science, passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan majorities. We officially began conference negotiations a year later, and the process was going well until the Senate stopped negotiating to deal with reconciliation. When they returned to consider our R&D bills, they decided to do it unilaterally, cutting the House out of talks completely. I've had a lot to say about this broken process, but the miracle is we ended up with research policy that largely reflects the competitiveness legislation House Republicans introduced nearly 3 years ago. It focuses its authorizations on transformational basic research, the kind of fundamental exploration that industry simply cannot afford to conduct. Basic research is the most efficient investment of taxpayers' dollars, and the dividends are extraordinary. As much as 85%, yes, I said 85% of our economic growth is due to advancements in science and technology. That's why this bill prioritizes the industries of the future that will further drive economic growth and national security protections, like quantum sciences, artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, and it improves technology transfer so that groundbreaking federally funded research can get out of the lab and into commercial settings where companies can invest their own money in applied research that has a specific, profitable end goal. I appreciate that this bill includes our approach to improving tech transfer at the NSF. Instead of investing primarily in applied research, this takes a user-focused mission and ensures that it will complement NSF's core mission of supporting basic research. Importantly, H.R. 4346 includes a raft of policies that will protect our research from foreign theft by adversaries like the Chinese Communist Party. It prohibits researchers from taking part in malign foreign talent programs, bans Confucius Institutes, and provides new tools and resources to combat foreign theft. And those are just a few of the many research protections developed by the House Science Committee and included in this bill. If I were to sum up Division B in one sentence, it would be this: it reflects the House Science GOP vision of investing in the future of American science, technology, and competitiveness. Now, despite the failure of the process, I'm very pleased with the outcome, and I strongly support this bill. We have a once-in-a-generation chance to set the direction for America's scientific and technological development and to ensure that our values of openness and fairness underpin critical technologies like AI and quantum sciences. I urge my colleagues to recognize the need for this bill and to support it when it comes for a vote. And I would acknowledge we're starting to get in many ways late into the 117th session of Congress. But I look forward to the things yet that Chairwoman Johnson and I and all the members of the Science Committee can accomplish together for the good of this country in the coming months, in the remainder of this session. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. And I think you and Chairwoman Johnson have set a high bar in terms of civility and cooperation, so I will yield to Mr. Cole for any
Well,
questions
thank you,
may
Mr.
have.
Chairman,
Thank
and I want to agree with you on that. I want to compliment the chairwoman and my good friend, the ranking member, for the manner in which they've worked together. You touched on some of this, Mr. Ranking Member, in your comments, but I want to give you a little chance to elaborate if you'd care to. Most of the public discussion and a lot of the controversy, honestly, has been around the CHIPS portion of the bill. But as my friend, the chairman of the full committee here, suggested, the bipartisanship between you and Chairwoman Johnson has really been a quite remarkable feat at a difficult time. And I'd like to give you a chance to talk about any of the other important science provisions in this legislation that you think might have gotten overlooked in the discussion. Because I think it's been a part of this debate that I wish had gotten more public coverage, but then maybe that's why you got it done, is you two were working productively and cooperatively with one another, and that doesn't happen as much around here as any of us would like, but you did. So if you'd care to elaborate on some of the important science reforms and changes that are included, and obviously, Chairwoman, you too, if you care to, I'd be delighted to hear about them.
I think the point I'd like to make is that we did the hearings, we did the field work, we did the markups, we used the legislative process the way it's supposed to be accomplished. And it became quite clear, I think, to the chairwoman and myself, if I can speak for her for just a moment, that our competitors around the world had figured out that the model of the United States from the 1930s until recent times of investments in national labs, the public university research enterprise, yes, using the tax code to encourage private research, had enabled us to become the amazing economy that we were from the 1940s. I would still argue we are today. And their goal of copying that the amount of money they spend on research is incredible, especially in China. What the chair and I sat down to try and figure out with the help of the committee was, how could we accelerate the pure research, the public research enterprise, in the most productive and efficient way? And together, we essentially agreed, and you know, there's much discussion about the cost of the bill. The research sections are authorized expenditures. They're not mandatory money. So we'll have to explain in front of our appropriation friends every year and justify funding those programs. But we agreed that over the next 5 years, in basically NSF and NIST and all these other programs, that we should double the money going to the programs, but it had to be scaled up over 5 years so they could efficiently absorb it and use it. Sometimes in this place, we throw out massive amounts of money, and in the next legislative cycle, we forget the commitments that we've made. And that's destructive. That's just destructive. So I'm very proud of that in the way that we set about to accomplish those things. You know, sometimes I refer to myself as an old school legislative kind of person. We may not agree on everything, and we may not be able to compromise on everything, but we can achieve consensus on a variety of issues that will drive the common good forward. Several members of this Rules Committee have experienced, for a long-term period of time, the nature of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. I'm just proud of the process we went through. I'm proud of the targets we set that were reasonable. I'm proud of the incredible amount of stakeholder input, right, Chair, that we took in from the national labs and the universities and everyone who was a stakeholder in this process. We asked and we listened. Sometimes we don't listen enough anymore in this building.
Madam Chairwoman, would you care to elaborate on any of that?
Well, let me say that the decentralization of the research hubs, I think, will be a big positive, and STEM diversity and including all brain power in the science, whether it's urban or rural or male or female or black or white. We felt that it was important to give everyone an opportunity to be a part of the workforce and brain power. And so we took the time to listen to all of the participants in our research enterprise, and we tried to expand what they had to say into some rational way of which we could make more opportunity to stay ahead of the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you back?
Thank you very much, Mr. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank both of you for being here with us. You know, although the House earlier passed a much larger investment in innovation and expanding economic opportunities in science and technology, or the CHIPS and Science Act, or this bill will also invest billions to strengthen our supply chains. It will lower costs for consumers and help American companies better compete in the global economy. Every year during the August recess, I take 2 weeks to visit with the small manufacturers in my community. So I'm very proud of this bill. I'm very, very proud of the work that you have done with the chairwoman. Specifically, this bill will invest $52 billion in domestic chip production, as was stated. But I'm very excited that my bill was included in this package. So thank you for that. And my bill will create a national manufacturing extension partnership supply chain database. I heard from our manufacturers just how vulnerable our supply chains can be and how those vulnerabilities can be a real threat in a time of crisis. Thank you to my colleague from Colorado. Our national economy is much stronger when we prevent supply chain breakdowns before they occur, rather than try to fix them after the fact. So, you know, thank you again. I hope that we can get a good showing of a good bipartisan showing of support. I hope we can vote on this tonight. And I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Lucas, I do appreciate all the discussions we have had on this over the past several days, certainly, but several weeks. I know the governor of my state is at least recorded as being enthusiastically in support of this. I know I have talked to technology companies in Texas who have been enthusiastically in support of this, and it's easy to understand why. There seems to be a fair amount of money that is involved, but there are people who talk about, for the same cost, if we perhaps focused on modernizing the tax code, we could increase competitiveness across all U.S. industries. So why pick one that is going to be the beneficiary in this bill?
Doctor, all I can say is that the responsibilities of the chair and I pertain to science, space, and technology-related issues. I don't disagree with you for a moment, but perhaps that's a question that should be put to another committee that has jurisdiction over these issues for a half a century. How did we go from the robust industrial manufacturing enterprise that we were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s to where we are now? I can't answer that question. I just know that we live in a world where everything involves microprocessors. From the phone in our pocket, to the car we might own, to every electronic device, everything we have. And being able to provide those components domestically, I believe, is an issue that will determine the survival of this republic and our economy, and for that matter, our ability to defend ourselves. If I were given the authority to take the whole enterprise under, say, along with Chairwoman Johnson, in a couple of years, no telling what we would do. But within our field of responsibility, we've done everything we can to move the common good forward and hopefully set a little bit of an example.
Well, I don't disagree with you on your observations on the microprocessor, and we've both driven by car dealerships in our districts that are completely depopulated of new vehicles for people to purchase. And I worry about the new car dealers and whether or not they'll be able to make it through this long dry spell that they're in. But at the same time, I mean, again, there are other industries that are worthy of our attention as well.
You and I both know, Doctor, from our discussions, that having the government prioritize investment in particular sectors reflects the focus of the time and the issues and the constituents. I can think of no sector where we invest more in than healthcare, but that's important. This is important too.
So let me ask you a question, because you started into a discussion on the budgetary outlays and the budgetary implications. One of the criticisms I've heard is that there is actually, this will incur more mandatory spending as a result of this bill. Is that a fair assessment?
On the side that the chair and I have primary jurisdiction over, it is authorized money, not mandatory money. So we'll have to discuss and work with and convince the appropriators that funding these authorizations is the best use of resources. That'll be over the course of the next 5 years. On the CHIP side of the equation, that wasn't within my bailiwick to offer a proposal on. I wasn't necessarily consulted with the final numbers and documents that came from the other body. But I would say this: if you can't buy a new feed truck and you're a farmer, or you can't buy a tractor, if you're a home builder and you're having difficulty finding appliances to go in the building, the houses you're building, which require microelectronics all, or when your cell phone wears out or your smartphone, you can't purchase another one because there's deficiencies, then it becomes a critical issue. I would also just simply conclude by saying, from my own perspective, if we've addressed these issues well, then maybe we need to work really hard on those other 9 or 10 or 20 or 100 industries.
Well, and I do want to thank you for the effort you've put into this. And I know it's been a long time in gestation, and it's been personally painful for you at several junctures. And Mr. Chairman, there's nothing against the chairwoman and ranking member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. But a week ago, we had a classified briefing with Secretary Raimondo on the bill. And then the headlines in the newspapers over the weekend was that the Speaker's family had made a major purchase in chips producers. And it just made it very, very difficult then to go home and tell my constituents why it's necessary to do this level of spending when, in fact, there appears to be someone who's personally benefited from the discussions on this bill. Now, I don't know that for a fact, but it has been widely reported in some of the news sources. Look, tomorrow, we're likely to learn that the country has entered into a recession because of the reporting of two quarters of negative growth. And I don't think it's any great surprise. People try to blame it on Putin's aggression in Ukraine, but it's really the spending of this Congress that has created the environment that was correct for inflation, and inflation has in fact occurred, and now we're talking about spending additional money. So I guess I'd like to see the resolve from the majority party that, number one, we're going to do things above board, and that people aren't going to personally benefit from the decisions that we make here, and number two, that we have a commitment to controlling spending in other areas. This is very worthwhile spending that Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas have brought to us, but it's on top of trillions in dollars of spending that has already occurred in this Congress. So I'd really like us to make a commitment as a Congress to focus on where we can pare down some of the spending, because we know the people of this country cannot continue or are having a hard time with the path that we've chosen for them. And Mr. Lucas, again, I appreciate the effort you put into this. I know you've worked extremely hard on this. Ranking Member Johnson, Chairwoman Johnson, I appreciate the work you've put into it, but those are the concerns. And again, both of those make it very, very difficult to vote in favor of this, given the current climate. And I'll be happy to stand by and listen to any observations that you have, and if not, I'm happy to yield back.
Yielding back?
I guess there are no other observations. And
Yeah, no, let me just say for the record, I think it's important when we are looking to, make various points that we all acknowledge that inflation and economic challenges are now is a global problem. There's not a country in the world that is not dealing with what we're dealing with. We're actually in better shape than most countries around the world. And in terms of if anyone's having a tough time deciding how to vote on this bill, my rule of thumb is what is in the best interest of my constituents. And I think, Mr. Lucas, you made a very good point about, this is something that if we don't address can adversely impact our farmers. Basically, you name the product. Right? And I also want to say that I think one of the lessons we've learned from this pandemic is that it's important to invest in, in research and development, and that's what you and Chairwoman Johnson have been arguing for. We have fallen behind, and we're paying the price, and it didn't just happen in the last year. It's been going on for a long, long, long time, and maybe we will learn our lesson from this terrible pandemic when we realize that we were outsourcing everything. But people should vote what's in the interest of their constituents. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I thought things were going along swimmingly until Dr. Burgess made a few remarks there that I felt were very much off topic of this particular piece of legislation. And first thing I want to say is that with the possible exception of my ranking member and my chairman of the Rules Committee, the best chairman and the best ranking member I have in this Congress are of the Science Committee. It's almost even between the four of you, I just want you to know. And the reason I say that is the fact that in the Science Committee and in this committee, there is a real respect between the people that are leading our committees. And that makes a big difference in how we conduct our affairs. And to the chairwoman and to Mr. Lucas, for my district, I have a lot of national labs. I have NIST and NOAA and NREL and NCAR and all sorts of other laboratories with initials as their names. And this bill helps the science in my community. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I'm proud of the work that our committee did towards that end. With respect to the CHIPS piece of this thing, we have faced shortages for 2 years since COVID hit. And it's chips one day, that's been lingering. You know, it could be the medicines, it could be test kits, it could be 1,000 different things. This pandemic hit us hard in a way that we haven't experienced before. And despite the fact that a lot of things, including my Safe Banking Act, which was in this bill until the conference committee, a lot of things were jettisoned along, did I mention safe banking? A lot of things were jettisoned. The guts of this bill really advance the interests of America, as you said, Mr. Lucas. And I turn to my chairwoman, Johnson. Do you have a favorite part of what we did in the Science Committee that's in this bill?
I'm sorry.
I said, do you have a favorite part that we added in this, that came from the Science Committee that's in the bill?
Of course, my favorite part of this bill is what we did as a committee. It was all bipartisan, well-researched. We listened a lot, and I'm proud of the result.
Yeah, me too. Mr. Lucas, do you have a section that is of particular interest to you?
I don't know that I have a particular section one over the other, but listening to the stakeholders, the university presidents, the directors of the national lab, going over with them what we developed in committee, discussing the ability to have 5 years of certainty in their construction, in their hiring, in their programs. It was like Christmas morning. I mean, they were happy, they were overjoyed, because they've been riding a roller coaster for decades. And the committee, the chair, and I, and you and everyone else, trying to give them the ability to do the amazing things, or should I say, continue to do the amazing things that they've all been doing for decades. That was the wonderful part. Listening and being able to respond that we had listened in a way that would be helpful.
Thank you. And I yield back to my favorite chair and ranking member.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler. Thank you very much. Mr. Raskin, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. So pleased that the House and Senate have been able, or that the Senate has gotten its act together so that we can finally vote on this. You know, like the infrastructure bill, this bill was long overdue. The U.S. is lagging behind in other countries in R&D and manufacturing of critical materials. So really glad that we'll be able to move this through so we can remain competitive in the global economy. I'm particularly pleased that the Senate has included language that we had advocated for that would provide for grants for STEM education to increase diversity in that sector as we're trying to spread the benefits here. I did want to echo the chairman's remarks about the fact that for the U.S. to be truly competitive on the global stage, we need to prioritize the American people as much as the semiconductors and scientific research that we are prioritizing today. So glad we're going to provide the funding for a $280 billion package to support semiconductor production, but would really like to see movement on the child tax credit, policies that are going to help families in my community and support them in a very challenging economy. So I yield back.
Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask the ranking member a little bit about Now, I think you mentioned some of the, kind of the guardrails to keep the money from going to China, and I'm just wondering if maybe you can talk about those new programs and about how they may protect taxpayer dollars from going to China.
Things like you can't use the resources in such a way that would transfer the technology for 10 years. Clawback provisions. If it's discovered that you have spent the money building the factory that you then duplicate in certain places, that has to come back. Those kind of provisions are basically the core of it.
And
There was
ranking,
much discussion about a variety of other proposals, but I believe these are strong and effective, but it's the max of what we could accomplish in the other body.
and just one last kind of thing you might want to comment on. How do you feel? I know that in this bill, there's direct appropriations to, or direct grants. And I know that in the past, it's been more of the tax. And you mentioned that kind of at the beginning of your opening statement, and maybe you could just expand on how this will be so much, it will be better.
Bear in mind that the much discussion $280 billion, actually $80 billion of it is mandatory money. The grants and the investment tax credit to build not just a factory, but factories. The other $200 billion is authorized money, so it will require coming back to the appropriators every year with this sliding scale. I would also suggest, and this is one of the places where I'm going to miss my dear friend, the chairwoman, in the next session of Congress, the committee has a huge responsibility for oversight. And sometimes in my tenure in this body, and not just the Science Committee, but all committees, sometimes we get so focused on building the brand new whatever, we forget to make sure that there's air in the tires, the paint's put on in the right place, all the rules have been followed, everything's been done according to legislation. I believe with this kind of money and this kind of a topic, the Science Committee, and that oversight begins as soon as the resources are signed into law, of course, but particularly with the focus in the coming session, making sure it's spent correctly and wisely, as we should on all committees on every penny that's spent. Because if this is big enough science, if there is a problem that appears, or if there is an abuse of these resources, it will cast a cloud on things that we need to do in the future. So we have to get it right. As my friend from Colorado says, he's got a project for 2033. We need to make sure we can convince and reassure the good citizens back home. You know, I have an old line that was used years ago. There's a fine line between doing things for people and doing things to people. I believe with this bill we're doing things for people. I want to make sure that that's clear to everyone, and that's where oversight comes in.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Johnson and the Ranking Member, Mr. Lucas. This is a critically important step forward for our country, and I think while we're going to talk about economic security going forward, let's not lose sight of the fact that this is economic security and national security and among the greatest needs. And in some ways, I appreciate what Mr. Burgess said, but I would suggest this, that while we could help other industries, this is microelectronics, the supply chain in microelectronics, chips, they're a part of everything, every industry, right? So even if it's advanced manufacturing, you may be producing products in Rochester, New York, where I have the privilege of representing Bausch & Lomb is building next-generation contact lenses, where no human ever touches the lens or the supply. It's all built by robotics, which are of which semiconductors are essential elements to it. I have Corning, New York, near my district, where they're putting another $130 million. They do diagnostic equipment on the microelectronics supply chain. So they'll look at chips and look for irregularities on the surface of a chip that is akin to finding a soccer ball on the continental United States. That's how small the tolerances are, and I think you all know that. And so we cannot fall further and further behind because our economic security depends on it, because our national security depends on it. And, there may be at some point a point where we're producing more chips than maybe we need. It's hard to predict what the market will be. But what we know now is we have a dearth of supply in the United States, and we're relying, on other places to do it. So this is vitally important that we do, and I'm really grateful. I think all of us in the House would do this perhaps differently, and we do have to rely on our friends in the Senate to do what they need to do, but this is a coming together. It's going to be a bipartisan bill. I think it's critical for, the United States moving forward. And this is not just chips, it's substrates, it's packaging, it's testing, it's assembly. It's the whole line of everything we need in the microelectronic space. And frankly, in my community where we specialize in one of the national centers on optics and photonics, integrated chips that will include photonics that allow, instead of electrons, photons which move at the speed of light. I mean, this is all the new world which beckons to us, but it's not going to happen in the United States without critical investment and intentionalism on the part of the federal government. And those who think that we could rely entirely on the private sector, that may be the case, but it may not be the private sector investing in the United States. And that's what we care about. It's what all of us care about on both sides of the aisle, in both houses. And I think the American people will really appreciate this when we're able to sort of explain how important this is, and the stakes are so high. The other thing that I'd just point out here that I'm a huge fan of, and I appreciate the chairwoman's staff and her attention to this, is the importance of regional innovation being invested in. We know that roughly 90% of the venture capital dollars around the United States goes to about 5 metro areas around the country, but many of us represent communities that aren't in, and no disrespect to, I don't want to get in fights with any of my friends who represent Austin, Texas, or Seattle, Washington, or the handful of places that manage to attract private venture capital. But there are, really, really world-class regional innovation ecosystems around the country that just haven't gotten the kind of investment that this bill promises. So I think that's unleashing the talents of people all across this country, and frankly, making certain that we open up opportunities in STEM for many people, communities of color, to women who just haven't had the opportunity and the investment made in them, and they certainly have the potential to add dramatically to all of the work that we do in the United States. So I'm really grateful, and I'm not sure I thought this day would come. I was afraid that we might miss this opportunity, but frankly, we can't afford to miss this opportunity. It's a vital national interest, and so I'm just grateful to the chair for her continued leadership. It's a great way to put an exclamation mark on an incredibly distinguished career. And Mr. Lucas, thank you for your participation, your leadership, speaking out on this. And I'm grateful. I'm looking forward to voting for the rule and the underlying bill. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Just want to thank you both. Congratulations, well done. Having spent many hours at the national laboratories here in Northern California, in the East Bay at Berkeley and Lawrence Livermore, just how underrated they are to the general public in this investment, to what you said, Mr. Lucas. So thank you. I could get used to this productive kind of discussion at rules.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo Mr. Perlmutter's comments. In addition to the delightful experience we have here on the Rules Committee, I just love serving on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and that's in large part because of the leadership of both the chair and the ranking member, who cooperate so well and care so much about this country and our future. And our nation has long been a global leader in science and technology, but to maintain this critical position, it's essential that we provide significant investments across the government and the private sector. We must meet the moment by passing the CHIPS and Science Act. And I'm pleased with this bipartisan landmark legislative package, which will bolster our capabilities as a nation in clean energy, technological research and innovation, and the domestic production of semiconductors. As you all know, because I always remind you, my district includes much of the Research Triangle in North Carolina, our nation's largest research park, which is home to hundreds of companies breaking new ground in energy, medicine, telecommunications, and more. And the investments and public-private partnerships afforded by the CHIPS and Science Act will provide these North Carolina-based companies with unprecedented funding and research and support, solidifying U.S. leadership in science and technology. The companies in my district, particularly startups, have struggled as a result of the global semiconductor shortage. And I was pleased to see the inclusion of over $50 billion in CHIPS funding to mitigate current semiconductor supply chain concerns, incentivize domestic production, and turn the CHIPS crisis around. I'm also pleased that this package includes several bipartisan bills I have led with members of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, including the Energizing Technology Transfer Act, a version of the NSF Technology Research Institutes Act, and the National Science and Technology Strategy Act, all bipartisan. These bills will help facilitate the commercial application of clean energy technologies by universities and private companies, the development of a national science and technology strategy, and investment in research and traineeship programs for graduate students. The CHIPS and Science Act embodies the type of investment needed to empower innovators in the 2nd District and across the United States. It is a bill for the future. I fully support the legislation and the broader mission. I urge my colleagues to do the same. I support the rule and the underlying bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question?
Mr. Chairman, I'd
Yeah, Dr. Burgess.
ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a document provided by the Republicans in the House Budget Committee dealing with the long-term budget outlook and the cost that the government is incurring going into the future, particularly with interest rates rising. I just think that should be part of our discussion today. Ask unanimous consent to put this in the record.
Without objection. Any other questions? Mr. Lucas.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the Chairwoman Johnson, Eddie Bernice, for all of her efforts on this bill and on the committee. And I would just simply note to you that with my, I hope, return to the Ag Committee next year, it'll be Farm Bill time again. This was a good run to get the memory stirred up.
I can't wait. I can't wait. Let me, on behalf of all of us on this committee, thank Chairwoman Johnson and you, Ranking Member Lucas, for all of your work in bringing this legislation to us today that we will bring to the floor. I want to thank you for the way you approach legislating, and you both are a model for all of us, and it really is refreshing to be able to have a hearing where you know, everybody seems to be fighting for the same thing, and I really appreciate that. Mr. Cole.
I want to associate myself with your remarks. I will also point out, it helps when legislating is done in the committee as opposed to the Speaker's office. It's amazing when the people that are writing the bill are actually the experts on the appropriate committee. And that makes a big difference in the quality of the discussion here.
No matter who the speaker is.
Yeah, and thank you for, so seeing that no one else has any questions, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. Please leave with our stenographer or submit electronically anything that you would like inserted into the record, and you now are excused. Thank you so much. Are there any any other members who wish to testify on Senate Amendment to H.R. 4346? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on Senate Amendment to H.R. 4346. Okay. Before I yield to my colleague from New York, Mr. Morelli, to read the motion, I just want to briefly note one piece of the rule that we're about to consider. As my colleagues know, at the request of the minority, we lifted some of the floor procedures that have been in place during the pandemic last week, particularly getting rid of same-day rule authority and turning on war powers procedures and resolutions of inquiry, among other things. So I'm pleased to see that many suspensions will be able to be considered en bloc this week. And so we are working our way back, hopefully, to a normal floor process. I want to note that this rule contains standard floor recess instructions for the August district work period, which have been a long-standing practice by both parties. They expire when the House comes back into session in September. So this rule should not be seen as impacting the changes that we agreed earlier this month. And I just do want to just say one other thing. You know, the volume of resolutions of inquiry introduced this week is a bit stunning. There were, I think, over 50 introduced and counting, which is very likely a record number. Looking back over the past few decades, there were almost never more than 10 introduced per Congress. And so I point that out by saying I genuinely hope that this procedure is not going to be used just as a filibuster committee time. But I want to thank our ranking member and others on this committee who have, worked with your leadership to make the floor process run a little bit more smoothly. I think everybody on both sides of the aisle appreciate that. But in any event, I just point that out because I'm just a little bit concerned. Mr. Cole.
Well, Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank you for working with us to make these kinds of changes and move the House back toward a more normal functioning. I don't know, your concerns may be well placed, may also be because we turned off that procedure for over 700 days, that there was sort of a backup in the stream. But I will associate myself. I hope we're toward a more normal thing once this thing sort of works through the system. But I think when you turn things off, you're not surprised when all of a sudden you turn them back on, there's a pent-up demand and that happens. So, but hopefully we'll work through that, and doesn't change my appreciation for you for working with us in good faith through the process.
And I appreciate, working with you and all of your help in getting us to a more reasonable and rational floor process. So thank you. And at this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant a rule providing for the consideration of the Senate amendment to the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 4346, the CHIPS and Science Act. The rule makes an order or motion offered by the chair of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology or her designee that the House concur in the Senate amendment to the House amendment to the Senate amendment. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the motion and the Senate amendment. The rule provides that the Senate amendment and the motion shall be considered as read. The rule provides 1 hour debate on the motion equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology or their designees. Section 2 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from August 1st, 2022 through September 12th, 2022, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved. The rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 2 of the resolution. Finally, the rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 2 of the resolution shall not constitute a calendar day for the purpose of Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution, a legislative day for purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 13, a calendar or legislative day for purposes of Clause 7C1 of Rule 22, or a legislative day for the purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 15.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just trying to follow whose amendment is it, House amendment to Senate amendment, Senate amendment to the House amendment. But anyway, you heard the gentleman's amendment. Motion, any discussion or debate, amendment, anything? Hearing none, the vote is now on the motion from the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Aye. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross. Aye. Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess. No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, Mr. Morelli will handle it for the majority. All right, then, without objection, the committee is now adjourned. Thank you.